Okay. Thank you very much, Adam, for that introduction, and most especially for the opportunity to speak today. As Adam has mentioned, I'm going to be doing a joint presentation with Marcus. Marcus was generous enough to give me the privilege to go first, which makes me feel like I'm obliged not to steal too much of his time. Although Adam has said we have 15 minutes. Adam, is that still true? If I'm lucky, okay. So as Adam has mentioned, I'm going to be providing a very high-level summary of a study that we just completed that was commissioned by the RSPO during 2011 to address barriers, to identify barriers to effective implementation of HCV in RSPO and some strategies to overcome those issues. I don't have any time to talk about the approach. For those of you who are interested, I encourage you to talk with me over the next couple of days. If you want to read the entire report, in about a month from now, you can send me an email. I'll be happy to share that with you, because it will be public domain. So as we've already had mentioned, HCV occurs within two criteria of the RSPO standard itself, 5.2 in relation to existing plantations and 7.3 for new plantings. I'm going to be focusing on 7.3 in the interest of saving some time. I've been asked to provide a very basic introduction to high conservation value for those of you who may not know what it is. It's, in short, an integrative participative framework for balancing social and environmental concerns with development objectives, and we do that through the identification of what are called high conservation values, of which there are 6, 3 that focus on biodiversity, 3 that focus on biodiversity concerns, 1 on environmental services, and 2 on social and environmental concerns. We do this through sort of a staged process that many of you will be familiar with, beginning with the identification of HCVs, if they are present, and if so, the identification of delineation of where they are found, the high conservation value area, the development and implementation of a management plan to maintain or enhance those through the delineation of a high conservation value management area and management activities to maintain the values, and then monitoring to evaluate the progress and success that we're achieving in maintaining those. Throughout that process, there's a very strong emphasis on stakeholder consultation, which is something that distinguishes the HCV assessment process from the environmental impact assessment that many of us are already familiar with. Okay, I think it's important for us to start address the question, why was this study necessary in the first place? And we can answer that by asking another question, I think, with why is HCV in RSPO controversial? It's very important, I think, for us to admit and to recognize expectations are very high. When we talk about maintaining high conservation values within a plantation context, we're talking about maintaining key social cultural attributes. We're talking about a zero net impact or zero positive impact on these attributes within a plantation landscape. It's very difficult to deliver that, and I think by most accounts we're sort of falling short. And this is due to a combination of confusion about definitions that I'll talk about in more detail, the inherent complexity of the biological and social systems that we're trying to manage, conversion, we're talking about the loss of natural forest and a dramatic ecological change, and so the stakes are very high. There are a number of constraints related to capacity, the lack of strong legal basis for protecting high conservation value areas within plantations, and also some questions about credibility that are tied to confidentiality of the report that we produce. And so I'll be addressing some of these issues in just a moment. There are 4 main conclusions from the study, and paying attention to time here, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail except to say that there's a clear need to simplify and to sharpen the HCV tool, not to make it easier, but to make it more effective. A lot of guidance is necessary to sharpen the approach that we're taking to management and monitoring of HCVs, desperate need to increase capacity across the board, and to promote, we think, some higher levels of transparency in reporting. Quick example of some confusion that is tied to divergent interpretation of definitions. This is HCV 5, areas that are important for the protection of basic needs. The HCV toolkit for Indonesia defines this very clearly as in places where local people depend on natural forest or other natural ecosystems for the provision of basic needs. This, in practice, is interpreted very differently by different assessors in Indonesia. In many cases, the definitions are expanded to include actively managed agricultural areas as well as rubber plantations in recognition of the importance of these areas for livelihoods, and a concern that if they are not identified as HCV, well, then there's a very high risk that they might be converted without adequate coordination with communities. Now, This is an issue that really requires some specific attention by the RSPO, in part because of some of the thorny questions that it can raise in relation to management. If we identify agricultural lands as HCV 5, does it become the obligations of the company to manage that? Are communities themselves obliged to coordinate in some fashion with companies before they change the land cover status? For auditors, if they arrive and look at areas that were identified as HCV 5 that become planted to oil palm because communities decided to do that, what are the implications of that during an RSPO audit for a company? These are questions where I'm not going to provide an answer to them necessarily, except to say that there's a clear need for the RSPO to provide greater clarity there. An example of more clarity on guidance for management and monitoring. How do we delineate high conservation value management areas that are required and sufficient to maintain values? Here, the HCV toolkit for Indonesia is very clear on defining what high conservation values are and how to manage and how to delineate them, but not how to manage them. And what that means is that different assessor groups are required to develop their own logic and rationale for how they would delineate a high conservation value management area. And a simple example here might be if we had a plantation with a number of lowland forest fragments of different size and configuration, it would delineate it as a high conservation value area. The question is how to manage them. Some assessors might say, well, we need to retain all of them and we need to work proactively to restore connectivity. There are others who might say, well, we're going to maintain these large ones that have the longest, or the highest possibility of longevity and lasting into the future, and that will be what we maintain and everything else could be converted. Or you might have assessor groups who would say, you know what, they're all small, degraded, fragmented, where's the value over the long term, so let's clear them and plant them to oil palm. I'm not here to say which of those management strategies is correct, except to point out that there is a lot of disagreement, and as a result of that, insecurity on the part of growers to understand what they should expect, what's a legitimate requirement, and so the RSPO is going to need to step in here to support efforts working with local partners to develop a more specific guidance on what will be required for management. I'm already over, I realize now, so I'm just going to speak to this question of capacity. There is enormous capacity among assessors in their ability to carry out the HCV process, and this has it's creates a number of problems related to the quality and credibility of the assessments that are done, and there's a lot that needs to be done to address that. Some of the things that we speak to in this report are to tighten the RSPO approval process to screen out assessors who at an early stage may not quite be qualified. Greater emphasis placed on the role of the team leader to take responsibility for the final reports. Mandatory, well-structured training not only for assessors, which is obvious, but also for companies so that they have a greater level of awareness for what they can expect and require of the assessors whom they're contracting. Implementation of a mandatory independent peer review. And also a development of a required code of conduct so that assessors know what is required of them and what will be the implications if they fall short of those expectations. One final point related to credibility. This participatory involvement of stakeholders in the identification of values and development of management plans is a key attribute of HCV. But once the reports are finished, they become confidential documents. To date, to my knowledge, there's still only one HCV assessment that was conducted in the framework of RSPO that is a public domain document. This means we have no basic information. How many reports have been done? Where were they done? What were the findings of those? We, as assessors, have very limited data and knowledge sharing because we don't read each other's work. It's confidential. It's also poor quality, goes undetected for a very long time. And I think over the long term, what this has engendered is sort of a creeping concern about the credibility of the assessment among public parties because they really have no idea what's happening, and fair enough. So some quick conclusions. I wanted to emphasize that despite all of these challenges, HCV we think is the right tool for RSPO, but we have to, forgive the cliche, recognize that we're blazing a new trail here in the sense that we're operating within a conversion sector without any well-established rules or support structures, and we're learning as we go. There's a lot of clarity that's needed concerning the role of HCV vis-a-vis other safeguards within the RSPO standard. We need to increase guidance that's necessary related to management and also capacity and transparency. So with that, Marcus, I apologize for taking as much time as I have and wish you luck.